Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Church Champions event. Whether this is your first event or you're a regular here, it's really lovely to have you with us. I'm Alex, and I lead Faith in Later Life, where we inspire and equip churches to reach older people with the good news of Jesus, disciple older people as followers of Jesus once they've accepted him, and to mobilize them in God's disciple making mission. Today, we're thinking about how our churches can become places where people living with dementia and those who care for them feel truly seen, supported, and included. We'll look at how dementia can affect people, how to keep relationships going, and some practical steps towards becoming more dementia friendly. I'm so delighted to introduce our speaker, Sophie Duncan, today. She's also a good friend of mine. We're in a prayer triplet together, and we've been journeying along for about 15 years or so. Sophie has significant experience in supporting people living with dementia in both church and care context. And she's recently completed an MA in practical theology, looking at how worship services can support people living with dementia in care settings. Sophie will share with us for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to have some question and answers. So do please add any questions that you have into the chat throughout the session at any time, and we hope to answer them towards the end of the session. Sophie, you're so welcome for our second time today. Thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing all that God has shown you over the years. I'm going to hand over to you now. So the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex. And it's a real privilege to be here with people who are so committed to supporting older people within their church communities. As Alex said, I have a particular passion of working alongside people living with dementia. And I guess my story started really when my godmother was diagnosed with vascular dementia, and she asked me whether I would do that journey with her. And to be honest, I didn't really know what that would mean, but we did lots of training, we did lots of reading, and we began to work out a little bit about the journey that she had in store for her and how we might maintain connection and faith connection throughout that journey. Through my godmother, I met loads of people who were living with dementia in the same care context where she eventually lived. And what I learned from them is that despite many of them having been Christians within a church context, that they no longer had connections with their church community. And I don't think that that was a lack of love from people, but really a lack of knowledge about the value of connecting with someone who perhaps can't remember who you are or remember the visit, or perhaps just not quite knowing how to engage. And so I thought I'd start to try and help people to understand what does it mean to support somebody who's living with dementia, both within the church community, but also when they're in a care context, how you can keep those connections going. Um, Today, I don't know very much about you, and you know a tiny little bit about me. And I'm sure some of you will have deep experience of working and traveling alongside people with dementia. Some of you might be caring for somebody with dementia, or indeed have a dementia diagnosis yourself. Or you might be, you've not really done very much work alongside people with dementia and you know little about it. So today I'm going to be deliberately very practical. I'm going to be practical about basically how do we live and work and engage people living with dementia in faith-based contexts. And I won't be touching very much on the theologies of dementia that perhaps I was exploring during my MA. But if that's you and you want to talk about that, then we do have time for Q&A at the end. To kick us off, I thought I'd just give a very brief kind of introduction to what dementia is. So dementia is actually an umbrella term that describes the symptoms linking to cognitive decline. And that umbrella term covers a whole load of different kinds of things that lead to those cognitive decline. And those different things are things like Alzheimer's or vascular disease, which you may have heard. Um, Dementia tends to be progressive, and it progresses at different rates, but it does tend to progress over time. And the early stages of dementia can be hidden, and they can be hidden because they're not yet manifest in how we're behaving. And they also can be hidden because we may know that there's something going on with our minds and our cognitive ability, but it's not something that we want to share because of societal attitudes about dementia. And I understand that people can live with dementia for, 7 years before anyone else is aware of it. This kind of umbrella term covers things like Alzheimer's disease, and Alzheimer's is the most prevalent of form of dementia in the UK, with around 60% of people currently experiencing Alzheimer's. It tends to be a really steady decline in memory. That tends to be what characterizes Alzheimer's disease. Vascular dementia affects around 15% of people, and that's a very different progression. So you have a drop in cognitive function, and then a stabilizing and a kind of a plateauing, and then you'll have another drop in cognitive function, and again a kind of a plateauing. Um, that affects Lewy body dementia is a different kind of dementia. It affects around 10% of people and is about a buildup of Lewy body proteins in the brain, maybe more associated with hallucinations and with maybe paranoia and those types of things. And then around 2% of people have frontal temporal dementia or Parkinson, and others have Parkinson's dementia. And around 10% of people have a diagnosis of mixed dementia, which means that maybe one or two of those conditions are playing out in their lives. So how does it affect people? Well, obviously, memory is a key way that it's affected, particularly short-term memory. And it might cause people to lose things or to become confused about time or place. And they might begin living in earlier memories of their lives. They may struggle to perform familiar tasks or start a task and then not quite work out how to then complete it. It might lead to poor judgment or changes in personality. It certainly causes challenges to communication, and it does lead to people becoming withdrawn and potentially being depressed. And sometimes that's a consequence of the illnesses that they have. And sometimes that's a consequence of them withdrawing, because as the world becomes less familiar to them, they withdraw from it because it's so difficult. I wanted to say a little bit about memory because I think that memory is a critical part of our understanding of dementia. One of the ways you might understand memory is that it's like a bookcase in your brain. And over time, you add books to that bookcase. So when you're young, you start putting books in the bottom shelf of the bookcase. And as that gets filled up, you begin to put them in the next book shelf, and again until you have your increasingly full bookcase of books. And as you put those books into the bookcase, you put those memories in with emotions attached to them. So you might put a very happy memory into a bookcase. It might be a wedding, your wedding maybe, or the birth of a child, or the birth of a godchild. And then you also have sad feelings that you put in with your memories. So you might put in a memory of the death of a loved one, and that would be shrouded with a sad memory. When you have dementia, it's like somebody's shaking the bookcase. And as they shake the bookcase, some of the books get dislodged and fall out of the bookcase. And typically, it's the ones at the top. If you imagine, if you're really shaking a bookcase, it's the ones at the top that get dislodged first. And they fall about on the floor and are no longer ordered and are less easy to access. But the feelings in dementia don't fall out. The feelings remain. So let's say that you're somebody living with dementia and you've just had an interaction where perhaps somebody has said something to you that has made you feel upset. And you've got that sad feeling, but already the facts associated with that sad feeling have gone. You don't know why you're feeling sad. So you begin to look on the bookshelf for the book that is associated with sad feelings. And you go through the books and you come to a book that's got the sad feelings associated with it. And you take that book and say, oh, that's what's just happened. So here I am, I flick through my bookshelf, and here's a book that's associated with sad feelings, and that's when a loved one died. So then I vocalize that I'm sad that that loved one has died. And a very typical reaction to that will be people saying, "Oh, but that happened 10 years ago." And I continue to feel sad. And so that sadness is reinforced, and I'm still matching the wrong situation to that feeling of sadness. And one of the things I think when we're engaging with people with dementia is we need to think what will bring well-being. So rather than saying, no, that happened 10 years ago, pointing out immediately that the person with dementia is clearly not perceiving the world as you are perceiving it, maybe say, well, tell me about your loved one. I'd really like to know more about them. You don't have to agree with them. You know that they died 10 years ago or whatever, but you can ask them and invite them to tell you about them. Or you can say, oh, why don't we go and find out about that? And as soon as they've got an ally, somebody else who's going to look into this with them, then their feelings begin to change, and they're no longer needing to search through their bookcase for a feeling and for facts associated with a sad feeling. And I think that understanding of dementia, obviously, it's a highly simplified kind of, it's not really, we don't really have bookcases in our brain. But I think it really helps to begin to understand that when people are expressing things who are living with dementia, that there's often a reason that they're expressing the things that they are expressing. And it's due to how their brain is changing. It is my belief that every communication that is made by someone living with dementia has a purpose. It expresses a need or a desire to make a connection. But it's not always obvious to us what that need is. And so, therefore, we need to work a bit harder to get at the heart of what is it that people are really asking for. Another thing that dementia does is it does affect people's social inhibitions. It might take some of the filters off that mean that they express things or behave in ways that we feel less comfortable with. And that can sometimes be really challenging. And there are cases where people living with dementia can get very frustrated and upset, frustrated about their experiences of life. And indeed, in some cases, that can lead to violence. And again, that might be due to the changes in the brain that are being caused by the conditions they have, or it might be just a reaction to all that's going on and the confusion and the experiencing that they're having. So that's how it affects us. So, what does that mean? What does that mean for when we try and be church together? And the first thing I'd say is to get some of the basics right. You know, there's some easy things that we can do to try and ensure that our church buildings are welcoming, accessible for people living with dementia. So the first thing is safeguarding the people living with dementia, but also those that they're walking alongside. Having effective signage, being really clear about where everything is, and with signs and images that help people navigate the space. This is particularly important with things like toilets, and the advice that is typically given now is that each toilet door should have an image of a toilet and the word toilet on the door so that people can easily locate where it is rather than having the image next door to where the toilet is, because that requires some cognitive matching to work out where it is. And there's also things about contrast. And so the contrast between the floor and for example, the toilet or the sink, if there isn't much of a contrast, it's hard for some people living with dementia to differentiate between them. There's also something about places being well lit and having corridors that are well lit, obviously without trip hazards, but also recognizing that shadows can be perceived by some people living with dementia as holes. So they either won't step over them or they trip over them. And so, as a consequence, really helpful to have well lit spaces where the floor coverings don't have big contrasting colours. To be a welcoming place for people living with dementia, then it really helps for the congregation to know a little bit about dementia and having that dementia awareness and a few tips about how to engage and how to draw alongside people. And then having some people who have that in-depth training, perhaps people that you might term as dementia buddies, people who actually have a lot of understanding about how dementia affects people and have the confidence and compassion to walk alongside people living with dementia and those that walk with them. So you've got the basics right. So what else can you do? Um, I believe, and I'm sure you will agree with me, that people living with dementia are as critical a part of the body of Christ as anybody else, valued, loved, and needed. And as a consequence, when we live alongside people living with dementia, we need to think a little bit about doing church a bit differently in order to accommodate all of us to be able to engage together. And what I've noticed with the churches that have tried to become more sensitive to the needs of those living with dementia is that it has benefits to a lot of other people as well. That some of the things that are beneficial for people living with dementia are also beneficial for older people. They're also beneficial for people perhaps living with neurodiversity. And so as a consequence, it is a real benefit to try and learn to be church together in ways that are accessible, welcoming, and friendly. I'm sure the work that you do as church champions means that you already know to make eye contact with people, to smile, to try and remember people's names. But also, when you're working with people living with dementia, you might choose not to ask questions that rely on short term memory. All of our life is asking questions. We do it all the time. It's our natural way of engaging with one another. But when you ask a question, there's quite a lot of cognitive load that is put on the person you've asked, who then needs to respond. So if I ask you today, would you like a drink? Your brain is thinking, well, do I need a drink? Do I want a drink? Have I had a drink? What kind of drink might be suitable to be offered at this time of day? Now, if you don't know the answers to those questions, the question suddenly becomes quite stressful. It's relatively easy to reframe your question, ask the same question, but ask it in a scaffolded way. So, for example, it's 7:45 in the evening. We usually have a drink about now. I'm thinking of having a cup of coffee. Would you like a coffee or tea? Something else? So immediately I know it's the right time to have a drink. I know usually I have a drink at this time, and I know what kind of drink I'm being offered. And it takes the pressure away and makes it much easier for people to be able to engage. Another key tip that I learnt from I did a lot of training, and one of the things I learnt in my training was this idea of finding other ways to have conversations, ones that are less reliant on asking questions. And one method is just starting to talk about something that you know the person that is living with dementia is interested in. And you start a conversation, leaving lots of space and lots of opportunity for the person living with dementia to join in. And then as they join in, you can reinforce what they're saying and build on what they're saying. And suddenly you're enjoying having a conversation together. You have to learn to love repetition. All of us repeat ourselves. I don't know about you, but if you had a situation at work or at home, and then you tell somebody that you love, and then you tell a friend, and then, we're always repeating ourselves. And part of repeating ourselves is about building shared identities and building our time, our relationship together. For sometimes with people living with dementia, the repetition happens in a shorter time scale. So they might repeat themselves twice in a conversation. But the joy they have in telling you that story and that connection that you're making is really valuable. So why would we turn around and say, well, I don't want to hear that because I've heard that before? Really important to care for the carers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It's not just an experience of dementia in the individual with with dementia, but it's also an experience shared by those who care and love them for them and love them. We love helping, don't we? We all like to contribute, and I'm sure you get a lot of joy and value out of the contributions you make as champions for older people. One of the saddest things that I found in the work I've done with churches is the stories of people living with dementia who told me that they've been told they can't help anymore in their ministry because they have dementia. Um, I think that we can be imaginative about how we scaffold people living with dementia to participate. Clearly, this is a progressive illness, and there are many, depending on the individual, there may be many years where participating in serving in the ways that they always have are perfectly possible. And then over time, as they become less possible, maybe we can be creative and think about how we can scaffold that. One of the people I interviewed for my MA talked to me about a woman in their church who was really struggling with putting cups away after coffee. And it was one of the jobs that she did. She supported the coffee rota, and one of the jobs was washing up and putting the cups away, but she couldn't remember where they went. And people were getting a bit frustrated because they were all ending up in the wrong cupboards. One option is to say, well, you can't do that anymore. A slightly more humane option is to put labels on the cupboards. And that's what they did. They put labels on the cupboards, pictures of what went where. And that meant that they could continue in that ministry for another year. Another example is from another person that I interviewed who talked about someone who used to set up for communion in their Church of England church. And as their dementia progressed, they began to be a little generous with the wine and with the bread. So they budded them up with another person in the church who could learn from them. They had a huge knowledge of what to do to set up appropriately for communion. But then that person also then could help with the quantities. So together they could serve. And rather than seeing that as duplicating effort, it's about us being the body together, isn't it? About bearing with one another, about contributing the part that we can do. And that agency, that sense of contributing something of value is really, really important. I ask you this question: how many times do you ask advice from somebody living with dementia? Do you at all? One of the things that I found really fruitful in my relationships with people living with dementia is to ask advice. I have to work out quite hard what kind of advice to ask, but people really want to give advice. And these people are people who have a lot of memories, still loads of books on the bookcase of stories and insights that can really help us. So, what about services? How do we develop services for people living with dementia? And the first thing I think to say is that social inclusion is really important. At the end of the day, the research now says that people living with dementia, the dementia progresses more quickly when they are isolated. And yet, there's a real preference for isolation from people living with dementia because the world has become so strange to them. And because we aren't always that well equipped at making them feel a social ease with being with us. And that's another thing we really need: social ease. We need to know that when we're behaving in a space, that what we're doing is part of what people expect and that we feel comfortable. And so, how can we as the body of Christ offer that comfort and support? The other great thing about church, I believe, is that we as a people forget all the time. Look at the stories in the Old Testament of the constant forgetting how much God loves us, what God's done for us. Um, and we forget. And people living with dementia forget. But within the community of church, we hold those memories collectively. And so, why not fold people living with dementia into that collective memory making of church? And we can hold each other's individual and collective memories and remind ourselves who we belong to and and who loves us. Doing services is all about keeping things short and simple, using accessible language. You won't be surprised that music is a real opportunity for people living with dementia to participate. They often have laid in their memories, in the low books of the bookshelves, lots of hymns or songs that are very familiar to them that they can sing and enjoy worshiping alongside you with. That's true of also of certain prayers, and notably the Lord's Prayer in the old language rather than the new language, but also certain forms of liturgy. If they've been to a relatively formal liturgical church, and they may well be able to remember a lot of the words of liturgy and be able to respond to the prompts asked. Really important to use creative approaches to think about how you can help people access a key point and things that maybe people can take away with them that will help them remember. really important to put everything that they need for the service in one place. So having a service sheet that's got it all in, it's a bit more work, but it makes such a difference. And a large print version is even better. And if you then use images to help people navigate that order of service, praying hands for praying, music for music, it really helps people be able to join in. I think we often think that people living with dementia are not really engaging with us. You know, you look out and we think, oh, maybe they're not responding. But actually, people living with dementia are responding. They're just responding in more subtle ways. And as you begin to appreciate the subtle ways that they're engaging, you can be really encouraged that God is ministering to them and they are participating in church in a really special way. In my research, people talked about how the peace would descend on a group of people living with dementia in a care home who were experiencing a service, that people would make eye contact, that they might sing, perhaps being non-verbal, and then would start singing. That sense of people ministering to each other, putting a hand on somebody else's arm who was feeling distressed. And having props and images that support the service really helps. So there's the images in the service sheet. Well, why not replicate those as physical things within the service? For example, a pair of carved wooden hands when you're praying. And for people who are worshipping in unfamiliar places, that might be a care home setting or perhaps a church that meets in a non-traditional space, how do we know that it's a church? How do we know? How do we prepare people that there's going to be worship happening here or collective worship happening here? And that might be providing visual clues. That might be how the person leading the service is dressed. It might be that they're wearing a dog collar, for example. It might be a cross, it might be candles if you're allowed to have them, or electric candles. It might be what's the smell of the space. And so people talked in my research about the smell of candles or the smell of incense. And one of the people I interviewed talked about spraying incense spray just to create a space that feels like this is a place for worship. I said I'd mention carers, and carers are super important. And there may be some of you who are caring or who have been a carer of someone living with dementia. And I think that all the carers I've met to date have told me basically that they're exhausted. Caring for someone living with dementia is a 24/7 job. And people can get exhausted, they can get quite depressed, but they also can become experts at hiding it. And part of hiding how they really are feeling is part of the problem that we all do at church when we all tell everybody we're okay, because we don't want to acknowledge the challenges that we're facing. And often people who are caring for someone living with dementia don't want to not be loyal to the person that they're caring for, or particularly if it's a partner. But they need a break from the responsibilities. And often they find it really difficult to take a break because actually the person that they love feels happiest when they're around. And so they feel this obligation to be around all the time and therefore not to get the support they need to be able to thrive as a carer. And that's why I love Dementia Buddies, because they're just little interventions that when you're in the church family all together, then you could just give 20 minutes to that person to go and pray with someone else or to have a conversation with a friend. People who are carers often experience great guilt if they're not able to cope. And not being able to cope is sometimes just that sense of being exhausted, or it might be that maybe they've snapped at someone, because they've got to the end of the question. You know, that somebody's persistently asking a question, and then they feel overwhelmed. And what the research has taught me is that because of how we live as Christians and our ideals of how we'll live together, that we inadvertently put intolerable burdens on people who are caring for people living with dementia, expecting them to be saints instead of being human. And so there's a sense of really recognizing and holding people in their humanity and making people realize that actually the work that they're doing and the love and care that they're showing is really valuable. And my other experiences of carers is that they're so often not able to accept help. So we can offer help, we can say we can do various things, we can do what, but they just can't accept the help. And I think that that's okay. Let's just walk alongside them and be there for them for when they can accept help and we're still there. Let's not abandon them in their caring. I wanted to close with talking a little bit about um, what I've called willingness and wonder. So, why is it important? Why is it so important to engage people living with dementia? And I think that are we willing? This is a big question. Are we willing to walk alongside somebody living with dementia? Are we willing to become a detective and try and find out what is behind their question? You know, many of the people I have worked alongside living with dementia ask me what time it is. I don't know if this has happened to you. And so you tell them what time it is. It's 1 minute past 8. Alex, I know I'm noticing 1 minute past 8. And then they ask again, or what time is it? And you go, oh, it's 1 minute past 8. And you're being all patient and godly. And then they've asked you for about the 20th time and you're feeling slightly irritated. Yes, it's 2 minutes past 8. And what I'd say is that we're not answering the need behind the question. And so the question gets stuck in this kind of round because there's a need that's being expressed. And actually, it's not necessarily wanting to know the time, it might be something else. So, what else might it be? Well, when I ask what time it is, I'm usually thinking, oh, it's 2 minutes past 8. Is it time for me to finish my talk because it's time for Q&A? Or is it time for me to go and pick up my children? Or is it time for me to make some food? Or is it time for me to go to bed? And so instead of saying, oh, it's 2 minutes past 8, you might want to say, oh, well, it's 2 minutes past 8. And this is usually when we make something to eat, isn't it? Or, oh, it's 2 minutes past 8. I know I've got less than 10 minutes left, Alex. And answering that can really bring relief. I'm not saying they won't ever ask you again what time it is, but it helps begin to address the need that's prompting the question. And being a kind of detective is a really it's a creative job, but it's always a really challenging job. So are we willing to do that? Are we willing to be the love of God alongside someone living with dementia? Are we willing to fold them back into social connectivity, to persist when they perhaps want to withdraw? Are we prepared to pop in and visit them when they're at home or in a care home, even when they no longer can remember our name? That memory of people is not only articulated in being able to say a name, it's, it's absolutely possible to recognize somebody loves you or that it's your being with someone who's familiar. Long after my godmother couldn't remember my name, she remembered the jokes we shared, and she visibly relaxed when she was with me. That's because she knew she was with someone she loved. And I didn't need her to know my name. I needed her to know that I loved her and God loved her. Are you willing to address the societal stigma of dementia? There's so many things in how society frames dementia. And John Swinton, who wrote a great book for those of us who love academic books called Dementia Living in the Memories of God, he says that this is called malignant social positioning. So society basically talks about people living with dementia dying before their time. And actually, those attitudes, it kind of enables us to kind of start to think of dementia as something to fear and something that makes us want to withdraw. We don't want that label because of what society says it is. But that's not what God says. God says that we are valuable, that our personhood and our value is not determined by what we do, what we can remember, how our cognitive function works. But our value is in that we're created in God's image and created into a relationship with God. And that is what people with dementia have. And if you are prepared, willing, then I want to say that you're going to be offered great wonder. There's a great wonder and privilege learning alongside people living with dementia. There's lots of ways that people living with dementia have ministered to me, have cared for me, have encouraged me, and they've shown me that God's love is absolutely certain. Psalm 139 tells us there's nowhere we can go from God's presence. And when I've experienced God working alongside and through people living with dementia, I can see it. One of the people that I met and became friends with was a great friend of my godmother. And one day, as I drove up to see them, and they lived a long way away from me, and I went up regularly, and I was driving up to see them, and I was praying, and to my shame, I was saying to God, is there any point in me going? Do I actually do anything of value? Could I use this time differently? Could it bring a benefit to somebody else? And I got to the care home and I had a lovely time with my godmother and her friend. And as I left, her friend grabbed my face in her hands and she said, "Come again, you bring life." And I felt that was God's words to me, that we need to keep visiting. We need to keep making that connection, and then maybe we can bring life. I'm going to close with the words of Christian Bryden. She was diagnosed with dementia when she was 53. And there's a lot of people living in the UK who have got early onset dementia. And she is an Australian, she was a businesswoman, and she got dementia. And she's been living alongside dementia, and she's trained herself to be an academic. And now she writes about dementia, and her writing is beautiful. It captures this kind of conversation between living with dementia and also having faith. This is what she says. I was hungry and thirsty for understanding and friendship, and you spent time with me. I was a stranger in the strange land of dementia, and you were there with me. My loss of faculties and social skills left me vulnerable and naked, and you comforted me. I was in the prison of my failing mind. I was sick, and you loved me.